As we turn from realism to impressionism, the first thing to notice is that Claude Monet's painting Impressionism Sunrise shows us down here that it was painted in 1872. Look where the artist recorded that date alongside his signature. So we see a new avant-garde movement less than 10 years after Manet exhibits his scandalous Luncheon on the Grass. It's also worth noting the dimensions of these two artworks. Look at Manet's 7 feet by 8 feet and 10 inches, really large. Monet's 19 inches by 24 inches. So the photographic slide that you're looking at misrepresents the size relationship between the two, the sense of scale. Manet's painting is a grand scale, close to the scale of human figures, life-size human figures, the scale of history painting. Monet's is not. It's the scale of what we call easel painting. A painting small enough to sit on an easel, a painting we will see that's portable enough to be actually taken and made outside, even on a boat. A painting that's small enough to allow you to capture the evanescent movement of light, air, the clouds, the weather. So Manet's painting, even though it's realist and scandalous, is still referencing salon academic values of a grand statement. Monet's is really turning its back on those academic values even more in certain ways. This painting is made by Henri Fontaine-Latour, one of the minor French Impressionists less well known, and he's painting it as a studio at Batignolles, the neighborhood where many of these artists lived, and he's showing Manet seated at an easel, painting an easel painting. So when we talk about easel painting, you can see small enough to fit on this wooden easel and to be painted in a relatively quick, short amount of time directly. So Manet, you know, as one of the key realist painters of the 1860s. He, though, is also really influential in this emerging Impressionist group. That's what this painting depicts. It depicts many of these Impressionist painters, including Renoir and the Hat, assembled around Manet as if learning from him. So he's sort of a forerunner to Impressionists, different from the mainstream of Impressionists, yes, yet also in a way part of the group. So your textbook introduces Impressionism in terms of origins, objectives, and subjects. This first paragraph is dense with important information, and I want to flesh some of it out. They talk about how a generation of French painters around 1870 continued to paint modern urban subjects, but their perspective differed from that of Manet and the realists. Yet Manet is a complex figure who, as I said, is bridging both worlds, the world of realist painting values, but also very much engaged with what Impressionists are interested in. The difference with Manet is this question of social commentary. So they're making a real distinction that we know realists from our discussion as being deeply engaged in turning the gaze of the painting of the artist and the public to subjects that have been devalued, and doing so with a purposeful political challenge. That we don't see this with Impressionism. And that's largely true, but we're also going to question whether that's entirely true. Because one of the things we're going to see with Impressionism is there are multiple artists who are part of that movement, and they all have a somewhat different flavor to their art. They share interests. They are often very interested in leisure activities in the countryside and in the city, but there's a different sort of emphasis. And so we'll see, well, to what extent is that true for which artists? The authors then draw you to their methods, their practices, their procedures. This is hugely important. It's one of the ways that they are profoundly avant-garde. They began to paint not in the studio, but en plein air, which is French for outside. This is a radically new technique. In painting en plein air, also called à la prima, artists are dispensing with underdrawings. They're working spontaneously in response to the fluid, changing conditions around them. This painting by Manet depicts the boat that Claude Monet used, and there's his wife, Madame Monet, in order to kind of drift about or anchor in place and have an easel to construct a painting en plein air, in the midst of things. So en plein air means outdoors, but it also means being in the environment, being in the elements, the water, the sky, the smoke coming out of the smokestacks. That's an important note, because we're going to see that these landscapes aren't always about kind of pretty vacation spots. They're sometimes about the kind of the places out on the outskirts of the city where the factories are. But back to actually en plein air. The textbook explains this is related to having mass market paint, where you can buy your paint in tubes and carry your tubes at a store. For centuries, painters had ground their own pigments from minerals. They had been kind of little chemists in their studio, creating complex chemical processes to make their paints. Art had been laborious, tedious, very involved, and now it's allowed to be more spontaneous. So now we see Berthe Morisot, Summer's Day, also a boat painting. So we're full of boats and water here. And you can see that there's a quality of fresh perception that comes from being in the midst of the drifting water with the leaves, where things are allowed to be sketchy in order to have a sense of direct sense experience. So Baudelaire talked at this time about the painter of modern life should have an eye like a child, because according to Baudelaire, quote, the child sees everything in a state of newness. So Berthe Morisot, she is not making preparatory studies for this. Artists who trained as academicians made dozens to hundreds of drawings and underdrawings below their paint in order to create precision. By dispensing that, the artists have what Baudelaire called the genius of childhood, a genius for which no aspect of life has become stale, a freshness. And it's related to a new attitude toward the materiality of paint. We don't have what was called a licked surface. David's paintings have a licked surface because it's utterly smooth. Think licked, you get your ice cream cone and the ice cream is all bumpy and rough when it's scooped on the cone, and as you lick it, it gets smooth. Painting had been a licked surface. This now is broad blocks of bright color with individual flecks of paint, squiggles, thick impasto sweeps. This is all drawing attention to the artist's hand and to the madeness of the vision. We don't see a seamless illusion. We see the painter's process of responding to a motif. This is an important word in the Impressionist world. Motif sort of is like your subject, what you're painting, but it is actually the French word for motive, the thing motivating, moving the hand of the artist. The idea is a motif is something you catch in the moment and you follow into a painting, which is different than a subject matter, which tends to be implied to be something more solid. So we have a mosaic of separate color sensations. We have textures that make sense as sky, water, trees, but we understand them all as being painted. And this marks a major turning point in European art, where the painting has ceased to be intended as an image of nature, a mirror of nature, and it has become a record of the impressions, the sensations of the artist, the process of the artist responding to a motif, the qualities of paint and color themselves intrinsically.